Welcome. My name is Rachel, and I am a librarian for the San Francisco Public Library. I am so happy that you are here with us for this incredible conversation with Nikole Hannah-Jones and Nikkolas Smith in partnership with San Francisco Unified School District and Penguin Random House Books. Before our program begins, I would like to acknowledge this program is live streaming from San Francisco, California. We acknowledge that the land where we are gathered today is the traditional land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. We must give thanks and respect to the Ohlone people by taking care of the earth, the animals, and one another. We acknowledge that non-Ohlone residents are guests on this occupied land, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, learn, and play here. We promise to uplift and respect the Ohlone people, their history, and their work. Without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce my colleague, Ayanna Thompson, SFUSD teacher librarian at the Tenderloin Community School.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, we had a little technical difficulty. I'm so honored to be here and be able to introduce Ms. Hannah-Jones and Mr. Smith. They knew they wanted this book to be a gift to Black children, and they wanted them to have an origin story. They wanted them to know their history and where they came from. And they wanted Black children to be proud of their ancestry. So today, I'm so excited that they are joining us to share the making of this book. And shout out to Renee Watson, who could not join us today. She is the co-author as well. So welcome, Ms. Nikole Hannah-Jones and Mr. Nikkolas Smith.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having us.
Hello. Is it time?
I believe she cut out again, but I think it's time. Hey, everyone.
We are live. Okay. Hello, my name is Nikole Hannah-Jones, and I am one of the co-authors of the book, We Are Born on the Water, as well as the creator of the 1619 project that this book was based upon. And one of the reasons that I created this book was this is in many ways the book that Renee Watson and myself wish we had had when we were children. This book really gives Black American children an origin story. If you've read the book, then you know that because of the institution of slavery, when many African people were stolen from the continent and brought to the United States, that Black American children don't have a country outside of America that they can claim and that they can take pride in. And so this was a story about the origins of Black Americans. But it's also a story, of course, for every child, because every child has an origin story and every child wants to see him or herself in the story. And we think that that is really important for all children, and that this allows us to have empathy and to think about others in our community and how we have a shared history, even as our history is unique. So I'm going to read a few poems from the book. So Born on the Water is told in poems, but not rhyming poems. And it goes over a lot of history from a young girl who was like myself when I was a child, and she got an assignment from her teacher where she was supposed to write a story and draw a picture of the flag of her ancestors, her ancestral land. And she felt very ashamed by that because she didn't know what her ancestral land was. So she tells her grandmother, and her grandmother gathers the family together and tells them the story of their people. So beginning with the poem, What Grandma Tells Me. What Grandma tells me. They say our people were born on the water, but our people had a home, a land, a place before they were sold. 400 years ago, our ancestors were taken and brought here on a ship called the White Lion, a whole year before the Mayflower arrived. But before that dreadful voyage, there was a time when they did not pray for freedom. There was a time when they did not sing about overcoming. Their story does not begin with whips and chains. They had a home, a place, a land, a beginning. Their story is our story. Before we were enslaved, they were free. And they danced. And they danced. And the people moved their feet, moved their whole bodies to the melody of horns and stringed instruments, of marimbas and drums. They danced to celebrate, to mourn. They danced as a way of worship, to offer thanks. Their bodies a song under open sky and bright sun. Their bodies a swaying testament to the beauty of creation. Stolen. And the white people took them anyway, kidnapped them, baptized them in the name of their God, stamped them with new names. Ours is no immigration story. They did not get to pack bags stuffed with cherished things, with the doll grandmama had woven from tall grass, with the baby blanket handed down from generation to generation, all the way back, so far back that it carried the scent of the ancestors. They could not hug their fathers and mothers, daughters and sons, hearts thumping in rhythm, clinging to that final sweetness before the parting. No promises whispered from mouth to ear of seeing each other soon. Just wails and sobs, confusion and wrists worn raw from shackles made of iron, feet split and bloody from the 200-mile march along the Kwanzaa River. They had no things, but they had their minds, the old ways, the harvest songs, the just right mix of herbs etched in their memories. They had their bodies, histories and bloodlines and drums pulsing in their veins. With trembling fingers, they braided seeds into their hair, defiantly hiding tiny pieces of home to plant one day in new soils. No matter what some people say, the people fought, and the white people took them anyway, forced them into the bottom of an evil ship to sail to a new world they had no desire to see. Ours is no immigration story. Legacy. And the people who were born on the water survived, kept living and living. It was illegal to teach enslaved people how to read, but they birthed generations of teachers and librarians, scholars and authors. They were heartbroken, beaten and bruised, but they became healers, pastors and activists, doctors and counselors. No one could steal the people's joy. They wrote songs, created jazz and hip hop, rhythm and blues. They became inventors and athletes, nurses and cooks, pilots and architects, farmers and housekeepers, singers and artists, dancers and poets, mathematicians and scientists. They passed on their stories through the stitch of a quilt, shared secret messages through songs. The people survived. The people fought. And because the people survived, and because the people fought, they finally got freedom. And because the people survived, and because the people fought, America has equality in the law. And because the people survived, and because the people fought, America began to live up to its promise of democracy. It is the people who fight for this democracy still. So thank you all for paying such close attention. And I'm now going to introduce you to Nikkolas Smith, who is the amazing artivist who illustrated this book and who really brings this book to life. And the very last slide that you showed is my favorite illustration in the book. And now Mr. Nikkolas is going to talk to you about how he did what he did.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, everyone, for having us today. This is just a beautiful time that we can kind of just go over, the importance of this book and also how this book was created. And I always say, Nicole, thank you a million times for creating, this story, this origin story for us, and also that we could flip through the pages and be reminded of how we got here and that we can be proud of it. And what I would like to do is, I love just going through the process of, how I create the art that I do. A lot of what I do is, especially for this project, is internalizing the poetry, the beautiful words, the history, and figuring out, okay, how am I going to visualize what I just read? Like the beautiful words, even sometimes the heartbreaking words, all of that, the joy, the pain, the struggle, the amazing people that came from this moment, how do I visualize that? And so I'm going to take you guys through a little bit of a demo really quickly. So I'm going to share my screen here. This is my Photoshop. I created the entire book in Photoshop. This is how I create all of my art. They're most of my art, digital paintings, right? So I have my wonderful Wacom tablet and I have my pen, and it's kind of like sketching on an iPad. That's how I created the book. And we created this book during the pandemic. And so we were pretty far away and we had to share a lot of ideas through the computer. So it was just great to be able to have this way of creating art quickly, sketching ideas, sending them back and forth. And that's really how we went through the whole thing. And, one of the things that I like to say also is that I love that the book began before the whips and the chains, and it shows you this beautiful kingdom of Ndongo. It's just beautiful the way that it started, and I wanted to show that joy in the culture. And at the same time, after all of the heartache, all of the struggle, everything that my ancestors went through, the pain, the fact that the book talks about so much of the resistance and the fight that was put up to gain their freedom back, because it was stolen, and then to see like all the amazing, like wonderful people and leaders and thinkers and designers, builders, all these amazing people that came from this movement. It was just a true honor to be able to visualize them or create them in a way that young folks, old folks, everyone could enjoy. And so if you look at the beginning and the end of the book, there's these end pages, and it's actually one of my favorite parts. And that really tells the story of the book. So you'll see ideas of life, death, and rebirth, which I feel like encapsulated the whole book, but in sort of this pattern of scarification. And one thing about African culture, you'll see sometimes markings on their faces, and they tell an entire story just by looking at the markings. And so I wanted to incorporate that into the beginning and the end, just to tell the whole story really of what you're about to see. And then when you get to the end, what you just saw. And so that is one of my favorites. And so this is the spread And They Danced. Nicole just read the poem. And this is one of the most joyful spreads in the entire book. It has a lot of music, a lot of dancing, a lot of jumping and flipping and everything. And when I realized as I was making the book, when I was growing up, I actually had a lot of these masks and different things actually on the walls, which I realized that while I was making this, these are from Central West Africa. These are from Benin, or this is the Chokwe mask. These are actually from my people. My people are from Central West Africa, and that's how I ended up, in America. It's the story of this entire book. So it was beautiful to be able to incorporate a lot of these different elements. But when I started, there was pretty much a blank canvas. And so what I had to do was visualize, okay, how do I want this amazing scene to play out? And the first thing is I wanted to show the beauty of Africa. Africa is extremely beautiful. There are, lush greens, there are mountains, there are waterfalls, a lot of things that you don't typically get shown on what Africa is and how amazing and beautiful it is. So I wanted to start there. So I have this beautiful landscape. And then the first thing that I did was I sketched in a few people. And so I said, I know I want to have maybe some dancers in the background, and I want to have some people over here, this guy here, maybe somebody drumming. And pretty much this was, what I sent over. And I said, I think it's going to look something like this. And then from that point, it's really just a matter of like populating the page more and more with different characters who can embody a lot of the different principles and a lot of the different really ceremonial celebrations that I learned about. So I will start with Gaia, I'll call her. She's playing this instrument. And at the beginning, I didn't know what instrument necessarily to have her play. So the beauty of, what I do is concept art. And so I want to visualize what it's going to be before it's there, right? And so that's when I, just start to sketch in ideas of, I researched this.
I didn't get that.
So this is like probably one of the most fun parts of concept art is that I have this brush and I can say, oh, there's this giant horn that is really cool. And it's from, it's one of the most ancient horns in Africa. So maybe I can draw something like this. And then I have all different types of, iterations from that point. So maybe I want it to be a curvy horn. So I'll take the eraser and kind of scale back a little bit. And, maybe it's this big, maybe it's only this big, maybe it's some sort of a straight flute or something like that. So a lot of what I do is just coming up with a lot of ideas of maybe it's like this, maybe it's like that, maybe it's, maybe it's some sort of blue horn or, it could be any color, it could be any shape, any size. And that's the beauty of digital art, really. And so what I ended up doing was going with the hoo-hoo, and that is something that I found that is native to Central West Africa, Cameroon specifically. And it's kind of like this flute with this kind of bulb instrument on the end. And again, sometimes I'm like, well, maybe it's this big. I don't know. Maybe it's this tiny or this big. And I go through all the ideas of what it could be. And I ended up making it about that size. And then what I like to do is create kind of these little lines that indicate what type of, where the sound is coming from or where the motion is coming from, just to give that movement feel. And from there, I even, have ideas on, there's so many different images of these cultural clothing in terms of, how they craft how they even specifically craft the clothes that they wear, what type of beads that they have on, what type of headbands that they have on, what type of jewelry. So many specific things that I couldn't cram it all into the book, but I tried to put as much of it as I could, from many different tribes, because one thing that you'll see in the book is that there were actually a lot of different tribes, of people that were stolen, and put all in the same ship and brought to the Americas. And so that was something that I wanted to specifically incorporate, to say that it wasn't just like one little group of people. There were a lot of people that were taken. And so from there, I started to add some more folks in there. I'll call this little girl Mercy. And if you've ever seen any, videos of African kids dancing, it is one of the most joyful things that you've ever seen. There's just, I don't know, there's just so much joy that these cultures had, that we talk a lot about the fact that you have to grasp how much culture was here, to understand how devastating it was that it was taken away. Yeah, this is a little girl who's dancing here. I have a tribe leader who is playing the drum, and he has this mask that you'll see in a minute. And then there are a lot of folks dancing in the background. Let me see, there's some, you'll see just scattered throughout different forms of dance, like capoeira, which is typically you might see in Jamaica. But one thing you start to realize is that all of these dances, all of these, instruments, all these things really originated in Africa. And so it was just a beautiful way of trying to say that, like, this is where we come from. This is where our joy comes from. This is where our creativity comes from. And then at that point, I started adding a lot more sunlight. I have what I call an overlay layer, where I just start to add a bunch more sunlight and making it feel warm and inviting and just joyful. And that's a lot of also for concept art, just trying to figure out how to visually describe the mood that you want to see. Like, there are some sad parts of the book where it might be darker and more blue. There might be some more joyful that I decided to make warm and fun. And so that is a lot of how, at one point I was going to add some water. I didn't do the water in this scene. But yeah, I added more and more layers, and then got to the final. Where do I have the final? There it is. So again, there are so many little details, and I could, even now, I feel like I could sit for hours and just like go back through all the little details. You'll see areas where I've added the marking for the symbol of life, which you see in the end papers. You'll see a lot of symbols of life here. And then in the following pages, the symbols of death and the symbols of rebirth, and how they all incorporate to just really make up the end papers that I showed you before. So in a nutshell, that is the scene of And They Danced. And I would love to talk about some more things if we want to get into some questions.
Thank you, Nikole Hannah-Jones and Nikkolas Smith, for sharing your artivist process and reading the book. So you guys ready for some student questions? We have some questions from Dolores Huerta students. Maureen, the teacher librarian, really taught into this book. And so we have some pre-recorded questions that are going to be shared for you to answer.
How did it feel to illustrate this book?
Did you hear that?
Great question. How did it feel to illustrate this book? Okay, so there's a lot of feelings that went into it because I think one of the first ones is just a little bit of nervousness and uncertainty because this is a very heavy topic in terms of slavery and how, my ancestors got here. And I wanted to make it right. Like I wanted to do a great job. So a little nervous, but at the same time, I felt a lot of pride and joy because I knew that it was such an important topic. And in doing all of the ancestry, research that I've done for me, I know that even the specific area, Central West Africa, that you see in the book, that's exactly where my ancestors came from. And, were taken from that area. And that's how I eventually end up being born in Houston, Texas. And so there was a lot of nerves, but also a lot of excitement and joy. And the fact that I could continue to make art that what I call artivism, just trying to encourage people to, make a positive change and get us moving forward towards, more justice for all. And so, a lot of excitement and glad that I could be a part of this really historic project.
How did you learn about that history?
How did we learn?
How did you learn about that history? I don't know who, either one of you can take that or both of you.
Okay, I'll start and then Nikkolas can also talk about that. But I have been reading about this history since I was very young, since I was a high school student. So I learned about this history through some books that my high school teacher gave me. And then for this particular project, we both did a lot of reading. And I also interviewed experts, historians who study the history of the white lion. I did a lot of research on Angola which is where the first Africans came from. The first Africans sold into Virginia came from, and I did a lot of research on what Angola was like in the 1600s. And I did a lot of research on that first family that the book talks about, the Tuckers, who are a real family who came here, and William Tucker, who was the first African child born in what would be the United States. So we learned this history by studying, probably much like you do in school when you read your social studies books or when you read other children's books and other types of books that teach you about the past.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, I didn't learn much about this in school. I wish I had. But my parents would always literally bring home statues and artifacts from Africa when I was young. And I learned a lot there. But also, I learned a lot from Nicole because she is an award-winning journalist and she's amazing. And she spent so much time putting all of this research together. And it's great that there are journalists like her out there who, have all of this information that they've collected, and then we can, then read their research. And I learned a lot, just going through her original 1619 research and understanding what parts that I could pull from that to start to make artwork, like the Africans, brilliant Africans who helped build the statues on the Capitol, the actual Capitol, the White House, all these buildings that we know of today. Lots of different parts of this country that were, built by my ancestors. Just so many different names and stories that were pulled from the original 1619 study that I could then create images for.
How did you choose to write the poems?
That's a great question. So I'm a journalist. I'm not a children's book author, and I don't tend to write fiction. But when we decided to write this book, we decided to work with Renee Watson, who is a very, very esteemed children's book author. And when Renee and I discussed, because as Mr. Nikkolas said, this is a very there's a lot of joy in this book, but there's also a lot of pain and a lot of sorrow. And of course, the experience of being enslaved is very, very difficult. And so we talked about what might be the best form to be able to talk about these really hard and complicated topics with young children. And Renee is the one who said she thought the best form for this would be to do this in verse. And I hope that the children who read this understand that poetry or writing in verse, it doesn't have to rhyme. It doesn't have to have a particular form. This is very free flowing. We use a lot of repetition. We repeat certain words or certain sounds or certain patterns. We end the sentence in ways that your teachers, when you're writing a essay or a paragraph in your assignments in school, would not have you write that way. But we felt that writing this in verse and poetry would allow you to pack a lot of information, but also to keep it simple in some ways for younger children to be able to engage with.
What happened to the community?
What happened to the community?
What happened to the community members and family members who were left behind in Africa?
Oh, that's such a great question. So we think a lot about, when we talk about slavery, we think about what happened to the people who were brought across the ocean. But of course, on the other side of the ocean in Africa, there were families who lost their family members and would never see them again. Many of the people who were enslaved, these were the youngest people in the community. So the people who would be able to farm the land, the people who would be able to invent new inventions, the people who would have more children for the community. And so we know 15 million people were stolen from, young people mostly were stolen from Western and Central Africa. And it had a very devastating impact on the people who were there. Also, the Europeans, in order to convince people on the continent of Africa to help them capture other human beings to sell, they started a lot of wars with different African groups there. So there was a lot of devastation that was caused by slavery, even for those who did not actually get stolen and brought over to the United States and other parts of the Americas. With that said, though, there are very many strong communities and cultures there. And the story of African people who didn't get brought to the Americas is also one of resistance and of resilience and of fighting against European powers who tried to mistreat them as well. And a few years ago, I had the opportunity to go to West Africa. To me, it felt like I was being embraced by our family members who we never got a chance to meet because of slavery. And you saw that so many of the customs we have in the United States, Black Americans, the food we eat, the jewelry we like, the colors we like to wear, the dancing and the songs. When you go back to Africa, you see that so many of those things feel very familiar to us. And I'll actually be having a chance to go back again this summer. So I think it is much like the story of Black people in America. It is a story of a lot of pain, but it's also a story of resilience and a story of joy.
¿Cómo resistieron los esclavos contra la esclavitud?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. I'm assuming there's translation then, since that
I'm
question
sorry.
is Spanish.
On the screen there, how did enslaved?
No. I see it. I'm just saying for the
Okay.
student, will my answer be translated for the student?
Yes, they're watching.
Okay, great. So I think this is such an important question, because when you think about how we often learn about slavery, we don't learn about all of the ways that enslaved people fought back against slavery. And of course, you know that if someone tried to force you to work against your will and to hold you captive, that you would fight back however you could. And this is what happened with enslaved people here too. So enslaved people resisted in big ways, like they would try to run away, or sometimes they would rise up and try to fight against the people who were holding them in slavery. And they resisted in other ways, like they would break the tools so that they could get a day of rest. They would work really, really slow if they could, so that they would deprive the people who owned them of their labor. Sometimes they would poison the people who enslaved them so that they could try to get free. They came up with lots of ways, and they resisted. Black people during slavery were not allowed to learn to read and write. And you would see enslaved people trying to teach themselves to learn to read and write so that they could read a map or write their own past to trick their enslavers so that they could escape to freedom. So it is very important to know enslaved people fought in the Civil War to help free themselves and their other people alongside white Union soldiers. So all throughout slavery, enslaved people were resisting in many, many ways. Thank you for that question.
What did slaves do? What did slaves do after they escaped successfully?
I don't know. Do you want to answer any of these, Nikkolas? Because I feel like I'm talking about, I mean, I can answer, but if you want to.
I always bring up Robert Smalls, because he's like one of the most incredible humans that ever lived. He did escape slavery, and like Miss Nicole mentioned, like a lot of these people who are enslaved, like they literally taught themselves how to read. Like imagine like being told that you can't learn a language, and then but that's your only way of getting towards freedom in some sort of way, and some sort of success after escaping, and teaching yourself a language. And Robert Smalls did that, and along with obviously Frederick Douglass, who was also one of the most amazing humans. Robert Smalls actually eventually, after escaping slavery, he ran for Congress, and he won and became a congressman. And that's something that you don't often hear about in schools. And I wish I had lessons like that when I was in school. But there are so many brilliant people like that who they didn't have any other choice. They did not want to stay where they were, and did brilliant things once they escaped. And so that's just one example, but there's a ton, I know.
So one thing that I think is important in this book is we try, at the end where I read the poem on legacy, we tried to make it clear that there were some very famous, very educated Black people. And there were also people who worked as cooks and as janitors, and that all of their stories are valid, and all of their stories are part of the human condition and are part of the story and legacy of Black people in this land, and that all of those stories are valid. So you would see after slavery, when some enslaved people escaped from slavery, they would do like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman. They would try to help other people to get their freedom. Frederick Douglass, of course, through giving speeches and writing books, and being abolitionists, trying to force the country to see that slavery needed to be ended. Harriet Tubman, who would go back into places where slavery was occurring and help rescue people, which was very, very dangerous. But you also saw enslaved people just doing things that normal human beings could do, but that enslaved people couldn't, like get married. It was not legal for enslaved people to get married, or just raising their children, because enslaved people's children could be sold away from them. And once they got their freedom, they just wanted to form their families, or starting schools because they weren't allowed to read, and they wanted to be able to not just educate their own children, but themselves. So you saw, after people escaped from slavery, sometimes an 80-year-old grandmother would be sitting next to her grandchild learning to read. They built churches because they weren't allowed to worship freely. So I think what is so important about understanding the history of slavery is Black people were fighting just to do normal, regular things that everyone else got a right to do. And so some of them got freedom and they wanted to do really big things, but some of them got freedom and they just wanted to be normal human beings and love their family and get married and have their own home and have their own piece of land and go to school and get an education.
Do you have ancestors? Do you have ancestors that were there, and how did they feel?
Yes, both Nikkolas and I have ancestors who were in slavery, though I can't speak for Nikkolas, though I'm pretty sure it's the same answer. Because slavery ended 150 years ago, we never had an opportunity to talk with them personally about how they felt. But we can read the stories of other enslaved people. For instance, the slave narratives. Some enslaved people wrote books about their experiences, including Frederick Douglass. And so we know how they felt. They were very sad. When they were in slavery, it was very scary. Sometimes they often felt like they were living in danger, and they understood that what was happening to them was unjust. And once they were able to have freedom, they were still sad because of everything that they lost. And sometimes when they became free, they couldn't find their children or their mother or their brother or their husband who was sold away from them. But they were also very determined that they were going to try to make America the country that America said it was. So I don't personally know what they felt, but we can imagine based on what we know from those who did tell their stories.
And that question came from the students had someone, a relative come who had heard the story of her ancestors. And so they got to hear that story.
That's such a blessing.
Nikkolas, do you want to answer that question, or?
I think Nicole
got it. Okay. Thank you, guys. So before I hand the mic to Rachel, there are some questions from the YouTube chat. I just want to give a shout out to all of the SFUSD schools that are tuning in right now. Tenderloin Community School High, Ulloa, Bessie Carmichael, Dolores Huerta, Cobb, Newcomer Lawton, John Muir, Hillcrest, McKinley, Rosa Parks, BVHM. So you guys, you have a lot of students watching you today.
That's so amazing.
So Rachel is going to feed those questions, right, Rachel?
Yep, so we do have a few questions from the chat. The first of which is for Mr. Nikkolas. How did you feel illustrating this book? Yeah,
I felt a lot of pride, but I kind of mentioned this before, just like there was a lot of nerves because I wanted it to be perfect, but I know it's also why one of the reasons why I do digital paintings is because for artists, you want things to be perfect all the times, and it's like nothing's gonna be perfect. But I started doing digital painting, and it really helped me just to, not worry about it being perfect, because, it's messy, it's sketchy, and a lot of the art that I do is now sketchy. And, that really related. And for me, it related to, the past and how I got here. There's a lot there. There's a lot of, emotions. There's a lot of ups and downs. And that's kind of like what this book was. And so, but overall, I was just very proud to be able to be a part of this project. And also, I think somebody was asking, like, how long did it take? And it was fairly quick. I would say it took about 3 months or so, to get all of the painting. I do speed sketches, and so they're pretty quick, and then it takes a few more days per page to refine each one. So overall, it took a few months to get it all done.
And then the next question is for Miss Nicole. And how did you feel writing this book with Miss Watson?
Thank you for that question. I felt similar, I think, to Mr. Nikkolas, in that I felt a lot of pride that I was able to tell the stories of our ancestors and everything that our ancestors went through, and to try to give them their credit that they don't often get. But I also felt a lot of sadness when you have to think about everything that they endured, how they must have felt. Renee and I really worked hard to show what we often don't learn in school, which is before slavery, people in Africa had not just culture and knowledge, but, they had their loved ones, they had their families. And when other people got to choose to immigrate here, they could pack their bags and take their favorite things and write back to their loved ones. And it wasn't permanent. But when African people were stolen, they didn't get to take anything with them, and they would never get to see their family or their home again. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And that was really hard. But mostly I felt a great responsibility to try to tell this story in a way that was honest. I believe that young people like yourself can handle the truth, even if it is challenging. And I wanted to make sure that this work really did justice to the story. So that was a great feeling of responsibility.
That is a great answer. For both of you guys, the next question is, how long did it take to make this book? And are you working on any future projects?
The timeline kind of muddies together in my head, but I would say from kind of conception to it being finished was probably 6 to 7 months. But then after you have the illustrations and the book written, then there's a long period, usually another at least 6 months before it actually gets published. But it takes, you have to have conversations about what is the book going to be. And then Renee Watson and I co-wrote it. So we kind of chose which topics we were going to cover. Then she would write some lines and send it back to me. And then I would write some lines and send it back to her. And then we went over all of them together. So that's about how long it took. And then, yes, I'm right now working on the 1619 documentary. We're filming that right now, and that is going to come out sometime next year on ABC and Hulu. And we're also going to be doing a 1619 book for middle grades readers as well.
And I am super excited about those upcoming projects. I'll say again, like that 3 months that I was talking about was, fit in there somewhere after Nicole and Renee, finished the poetry. And then I came on board and started to kind of like figure out how I could visualize those poems, and then the 3 months of illustration. And for future projects, I have a superhero children's book that I can't tell you which one, but they're really cool Marvel superhero that's coming out this year, and also a book with Ruby Bridges this year. So
That's
those,
awesome.
yeah.
That is so exciting to hear about your future projects. Oh my goodness, I'm looking forward to both of them. Let's see. Another question that we have is for Nicole. What books did you use for your research?
So I didn't use a ton of books though before The Mayflower by Lerone Bennett. But for the children's book, I actually really was reading a lot of research papers. So research papers on the Hampton Museum in Hampton, Virginia, which is adjacent to the first landing spot of those Africans, had put together an entire report around the 400th anniversary where they really, this is probably at a way too high level, synthesized, really brought together all of the different research on this. And so I spent a lot of time doing that. I went to the museum and went through all of the exhibits, and then I interviewed historians. And then I just, from a bunch of different sources, was looking specifically about what it was like in Angola at that time. But I don't have like a list of books specific to this book. Also keep in mind, I've been studying this stuff for 20 years. So twice the lifetime of the children on here. And so a lot of these things I know from years and years of research and study as well.
All right. And then the next question, I believe it's for both of you. Is there anything you would change or add to the book?
Nikkolas?
Is there anything I would change? I don't think I would change anything. An addition, I think an addition would just be a continuation of what your answer, Nicole, might be, which it had to do with just kind of I think the spread, or I don't know the right words for it, but there were many different branches that were involved in the slave trade. And so it's like, there's so many more stories to tell. So many more illustrations and so many more people to visualize. And so it's endless. So there's a lot.
That's a good question. And that's a hard question, because normally anything that I write as a journalist, I can always tell you all the things I wish I could change or add to it. But I actually kind of love this book the way that it is. We could certainly add more stories. You could certainly add some stories in from other places in the Americas that African people were sold into, like in the Caribbean and South America, Central America, Mexico. And you could add all of those things. But then I feel like the book would start to lose a bit of what gives it its power. So I don't think I would add much or of anything to this book, but I think you could have other volumes of this book that take place in other parts of the Americas, and that just expand the story, particularly of the Tuckers of Tidewater, which are that first group. Their ancestors are still in Virginia, or descendants, sorry, are still in Virginia. And I think it would be awesome to have a book that told their story as well.
That would be absolutely amazing. And I think we have time for one more question, and it is for both of you. And how did you get connected to work on this book together?
I received a wonderful, life-changing email, and I feel like it was partially in connection to the fact that for 8 years I've been doing artivist work, and really just trying to have art that speaks to justice for all. And the book is just it embodies that mission. And so, yeah, I think you guys had looked at my work and thought that it would be a good fit. And so.
Yeah, absolutely. When we decided to do the children's book, our publisher presented us with several great illustrators, but all of us were just really struck by Mr. Nikkolas's work and the beauty, both the beauty and the simplicity of it. In some ways, it just seemed like we all agreed that he was the one. So we had a conversation, and it was also clear once we actually were able to talk to Mr. Nikkolas that he was the perfect one to illustrate this book, because it really did have to be a partnership. We had to be able to trust. Like, you can't tell an artist, this is what you should draw. You have to allow the artist to interpret the words in a way that he or she sees fit. But what that means is that you have to have an artist who really understands what it is that you're trying to do. And it was clear that Mr. Nikkolas did. And the very first sketch he showed us was, it didn't have the little boy on there, but it had the little girl and the water and the colors. And when we saw it, I just couldn't believe how perfectly he understood what this book should do. And I think when you look through it and you see even the really painful parts, his illustrations just so, the tone is perfect. The respect for what is happening is perfect. The respect for the reader and the viewer is perfect. So that's how we came to work together. And we actually started working together during the pandemic. So we never even got to meet each other until a few months ago. And so that was a really awesome experience, which I'm sure many of you students understand because you were also going to school during the pandemic and didn't get to meet some of your classmates. So
that is a beautiful story of connection. And I think that is time. That's all the questions we can take. And I will say thank you so much to Nikole Hannah-Jones and to Nikkolas Smith, their publisher, Penguin Random House, and SFUSD for today's program. Remember, you can find these amazing books from your local SFPL library location, and you can talk to your teacher librarians and use your Scholar card to access them. If you love today's program and want to watch again, visit the San Francisco Public Library's YouTube channel. This recording is available for the next month. That's all for today, folks. Take good care of yourselves, stay safe, and we hope to see you back at the SFPL Virtual Library again soon. Bye.
Thank you, guys.